Ladies and gentlemen, the title of my lecture is Words Memorial Topic in the 20th Century and Schoenberg's Modernist Genealogies. First of all, I want to thank very much Bianca Temes for inviting me to such a marvelous conference in these difficult times. According to Cicero, the memoria, the memory, is a thesaurus rerum omnium, a treasure trove of all things. And since a cultural term, literary and pictorial studies consider it as fundamental. For the production, reception, and history of music, memoria also plays a central role. After all, Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, was the mother of all muses in Greek mythology. My lecture today was written in times of the COVID-19 pandemic, when libraries and archives were closed. I dedicate it to a friend of mine, the Spanish philosopher and sociologist Ignacio Sotelo, who died last spring in Berlin. It consists of two parts. A first, in which I sketch out aspects of memorial topics and remembrances of the dead, using examples from Gustav Mahler and Richard Strauss. And a second on Arnold Schoenberg, which deals with familial and artistic genealogies of origin and descent, with the prerequisites and consequences of Schoenberg's work. So we come to the first part, words memorial topic in the 20th century. The first point, memorial topic and remembrance of the dead. At the beginning, a narrative directly targets an anthropological core, the remembrance of the dead who live on in the memory of their descendants. It is a story of Simonides of Chios, a Greek poet from the 6th and 5th century BC. While attending a banquet inside the house of a certain Scopas, two gods, the two Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, call him to the door, and the house suddenly collapses, leaving Simonides as the only one of those lying at the banquet to survive the misfortune with a multitude of deaths. When the relatives of the victims now arrive at the scene of the catastrophe to identify their loved ones and bury them according to the rite, they find the dead disfigured beyond recognition, though that identification seems impossible. But Simonides, the survivor, has memorized the seating arrangement of the invited guests in the room. Thus, based on his information, all the victims can be identified by name and buried according to custom. This is the story of Simonides, an anecdote illustrating his legendary strength of memory, told by rhetoric teachers such as the classics Cicero and Quintilian. Since ancient times, authors have developed an ars memorativa, an art or technique of memory, and contrasted it with an ars oblivionalis, an art of forgetting. In music, its history, its theory, the memory of the dead manifests itself in genres, styles, topoi, and individual words. Here I recall the marcia funebre, the nenie or the tombeau in memory of the deceased, as I have examined them in the books Weltanschauungsmusik and Metamusik, on Josquin des Prés and Memorial Works of the Renaissance, Brahms' Nänie, or Boulet's Tombeau, the final movement from Pli selon Pli. We come now to the second point, ironic commemoration of the dead in Mahler's First Symphony. The monumental celebration of the dead, Totenfeier, the first movement of the Second Symphony, is contrasted by an ironic type in the third movement of the First Symphony. Here, the idea of the celebration of the dead is designed according to the mode of inversion, a basic strategy of artistic modernism proclaimed by Friedrich Schlegel in the early Romantic period around 1800. Animals accompany the hunter's funeral procession. In Moritz von Schwind's woodcut from 1850, the normally hunted form the escort. How did Mahler conceive this movement, which early critics acknowledge with concentrated rage? The sublime act of a funeral procession has been transformed into a musical grotesque due to the Brother Jacob canon. Everything that characterizes the idea of the symphonic is negated here, reduced to absurdity. A short time later, whipped out of regularity, a distortion arises which aptly characterizes the hunter's funeral procession. A peculiar mixture of minor and major leads to sharp, unusual sounds that reflect the abnormal reversal. Let's hear a short excerpt from this movement, the slow movement of Mahler's First Symphony. Claudia Abbado conducts the Lucerne Festival Orchestra. The artistic structure finds its biographical correlation in Mahler's statement that since early childhood he could never experience things without their opposite. which is why he is inevitably seized by a stimulus to ridicule every solemn action, a modern psychological pattern. The aesthetic subject of the music is thus an inversion of heroism. When the object of the hunt takes its subject to the grave, social norms appear reversed, partly religiously, partly playfully. In artistic modernism, the remembrance of the dead drives new figures out of used-up material, refuses to pose in the usual emotional and sublime manner. I come to my next point, dispute over In Memoriam. Strauss quotes Beethoven's Eroica. A famous, controversial In Memoriam was set by Richard Strauss in the final weeks of World War II at the end of his Metamorphosen from 44-45, where cellos and basses quote the Marcia Funebre melody from Beethoven's Third Symphony Opus 55 in the original key of C minor and double note values. Who or what does this commemoration of the dead mean, and linked to it the festeggiare il sovvenire di un grand'uomo of the Sinfonia Eroica? The author Strauss kept silent about this. Criticism and hermeneutics are called upon to formulate answers. What has happened abundantly in the history of the reception of this work? All suggestions made can be based on long traditions, so they should not be hastily banned from any of today's perspectives. We hear now the beginning of the Marcia Funebre from Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. Erich Kleiber conducts the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra. And afterwards, the end of Strauss' Metamorphosen with the Beethoven quotation in the bass. Kirill Petrenko conducting the Orchestre Philharmonique de Radio France. Here, I will discuss an early case in the reception history of Metamorphosen. The conflict potential of a work composed in the final phase of the Third Reich, including its in memoriam, apparently also depends on the place of the critique. In multilingual Switzerland, which remained neutral during the war, a controversy arose in the fall of the year following the Zurich premiere on January 25, 1946, when two newspapers reprinted a polemic against the Dutch premiere of the Metamorphosen in German translation. The conductor, Kurt Rudolf Mengelberg, it says here, forced the audience to, quote, celebrate the loving memory of the man in whose name and on whose orders the killing took place, unquote. Willi Schuh, editor of the Schweizerische Musikzeitung, rejected the thesis that the composer's in memoriam meant Adolf Hitler. Quote, the words in memoriam, that is, in memoriam Beethoven's. Of course, the note refers only to the quotation, not to the entire work. That this purely musical fact could be turned into a political issue remains incomprehensible, unquote. However, music and politics could not be separated so easily, especially since Willi Schuh, Strauss' chosen biographer and hoped for author of Contributions to the World History of Music, in a letter by Richard Strauss addressed to him on May 20th, 1946, could read, I quote, when the book can appear is a second question, since today there is at least a danger that its author, that is Schuh, will be torn apart, quartered, broken to pieces, if he has the courage to write that political Germany had to be destroyed after its world mission, the creation and perfection of German music was fulfilled, unquote. In terms of aesthetic fundamentalism, such a horrendous thought eclipses Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's admiration of the terrorist attack of 9/11/2001. Whether counter or concurrently conceived, today, a politically, militarily destructive nationalism is as unacceptable as the artistically triumphant one of a musical world mission. But admittedly, today we also see the discussions about local, global perspectives, about national, post-national perspectives, about modern, post-modern perspectives, about heroic, post-heroic perspectives, about Eurocentric, post-colonial perspectives, about gender controversial perspectives are by no means finished. They are probably not to be resolved. Now I come to my second part, Schoenberg's modernist genealogies. I start out from two things: the ambivalence of history as res gestae or historia rerum gestarum, and the difficulty of making a clear distinction between history and myth. Political and military deeds, better or worse, planned and executed actions of historically relevant persons are justified, accompanied, and followed by their narratives, whose direction of thrust, which is never without a point of departure, appears apologetically, polemically, or neutrally formulated. The entanglement of history and myth, demonstrated by such great cases as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Napoleon Bonaparte, also plays an essential role in art and music history. The artists of the modern age no longer follow Goethe's saying, quote, "Create, artists, do not speak. Let only a breath be your poem," unquote. Rather, artists themselves, alongside critics and friends, speak out publicly at length, do not observe any secrecy, and supplement their sound and notation acts, the poiesis of works by execution and writing, with comments of all kinds. Genealogies, familiar as well as artistic, always run in two time directions. On the one hand, with regard to origin in the direction of past and present, of ancestors or sources of influence, and on the other hand, with regard to future in the direction of present and future of descendants or subjects of reception. Both directions are closely related. In the following, I would like to sketch out how all this presents itself for Arnold Schoenberg. Let us start with the familial genealogy. This is the first point. As is well known, Beethoven, as was the case in older social patterns, came from a family of musicians. For his grandfather and his father were already employed as Hofkapellmeister and singer at the Bonn court, residents of the clerical Kurfürstentum Cologne. Schoenberg, on the other hand, the son of a Jewish shoemaker who had moved to Vienna from northern Hungary, grew up in poor conditions without any career prospects for music. Hans Sachs' world of Meistersinger also seemed far removed from his father's educational aspirations. His individual will stood without any support by his family. Schoenberg, capable of learning, eager to learn, created his knowledge, his ability, his career himself. He was married twice and lived in the orderly bonds of marriage. The choice of wives, Mathilde von Zemlinsky, after her death, Gertrud Kohlisch, had fruitful musical references, for she was a sister of Alexander von Zemlinsky, who, supported by Brahms, was a successful composer, pianist, and conductor. Although relations with his brothers-in-law loosened over time, they formed a foundation for Schoenberg's development. The first married for the compositional, the second for the performative. Among Schoenberg's children and grandchildren, Nuria Nono Schoenberg, the daughter born in 1932 from the second marriage, wife and widow of Luigi Nono, is still particularly influential today, also transferring the estate from Los Angeles to Vienna and founding the Arnold Schoenberg Center there in 1998. With this, I come to the next point, artistic genealogy. While for Beethoven's genealogy of the future, the growing fame in improvisation, performance, and compositional art was initially basic, but not in music education. A century later, for Schoenberg's genealogy, the art of composition was also central, flanked, however, by an enthusiastically pursued teaching activity in analysis, theory, and composition. For the mythogenesis of these artists, working with students, the help of students, and the reception of the writings are fundamental. While a familial genealogy is about pure facts, an artistic one must be constructed through analysis of work structures and through the collection, examination, and interpretation of self and foreign testimonies, which, however, in view of Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence, must by no means be taken at face value. I mentioned two texts. First, the article Nationale Musik of 1931, which states, quote, "My teachers were first and foremost Bach and Mozart. In the second, Beethoven, Brahms, and Wagner." Then the sentence, "I have also learned a lot from Schubert and also from Mahler, Strauss, and Reger," unquote. The second, the dedicatory words of the Harmonielehre of 1911. This dedication to a recently deceased colleague is a document sui generis. Quote, "This book is dedicated to the memory of Gustav Mahler," unquote. The first edition is followed by 3 prose paragraphs which mythologize the dead as martyr and saint, and which, unveiled, aim at a self-elevation of the dedicating author. Mahler's transfiguration resonates with a high degree of self-suggestion. Only a year and a half before writing this art religious dedication, Schoenberg, who now worships the immortal compositions, had spoken to Mahler personally of mere art struggle moments in respect of his partisanship. And in the mid-1920s, he will no longer hear Mahler's music for a decade, for fear that the earlier rejection would return. Musicology must examine such testimonies for the ever and ever formulated meaning as expression and message. Idolatry is less blasphemy than an involuntary parody of a worship under the sign of art religion. God, creator, author with legislative competence without rules or restrictions. The only voice to obey is a daimon, in which the genius of a human being experiences formative power to create art, analogous to the creation of nature. Philosophy and political theory speak of a charismatic type of rule, which commands the people who follow it. The Schoenberg school is based on such a type. It is not only a school in the field of the art of music, it is more, a school for the entire life. That this type, based on a decisionism of unfounded choices, poses serious problems, is evident in politics, in the humanities, but also in the arts. When great heroes in all fields have determined myths as well as history, One may wonder whether Schoenberg belongs to the winners of music history or not. I tend to answer this question in the affirmative. Quote, I learned this book from my students, unquote. The beginning of the Harmonielehre does not show a teacher who knows much, can do much more, and passes all this on to his students in a lecturing manner, but rather one who followed the saying, docendo discimus, learning by teaching, which has been handed down since antiquity. Schoenberg did not base his teaching on traditional used writings of the music theoretical disciplines, harmony, counterpoint, compositional practice, form theory. He pursued what in our times is called artistic research. With the book published in 1911, he pedagogically opened up the foundation of the very art of music, which he had abandoned in his own work a few years earlier with the transition to free atonality. The autocratic trait of his personality was marked by the prose style. According to Schoenberg, eternal laws of art exist only in the minds of the despised theorists, who have never experienced true creative activity. Quote, by my students, but they, my students, know, so tells the preface, what is important to search, unquote. The implicitly legitimizing thrust of the writing that seeks to convey to the students the fundamentals of tonal composition, offering numerous examples, and, on the other hand, presents these basics as artistically meaningful but historically abolishable, marks exactly its location, the result of many years of instruction in a compositional practice which led Schoenberg away from harmonic tonality. Now come to the next point, Alban Berg, idolatry and despair. According to the Mahler consecration of the Harmonielehre, Schoenberg soon assumed the status of a founder of art religion. On August 3rd, 1911, Alban Berg wrote to him, I quote, now I have also received the conclusion of the Harmonielehre and the beginning, the godly preface and the dedication. Now this wonderful book has received its final consecration. Before one enters the sanctuary, one kneels devoutly and crosses oneself in highest humility. And that we poor mortals may have a share in it is our greatest happiness. We thank you for this, beloved Mr. Schoenberg. Unquote. In order to illustrate aspects of the Kunstkampf or Kunstkrieg, let us stay with Alban Berg. Together with Anton Webern, he whose correspondence with Schoenberg is available in an exemplary edition, counts among Schoenberg's primary students. Liberty, freedom of decision, or even neutrality generally do not exist in war. There is only pro or contra, friend or enemy. In Berg's letter of September 25, 26, 1911, the Mahler consecration comes through, I quote, but that you allow me to pass myself off as your deputy, is a great happiness for me in these days of saddest expectation. For there is so much glory in being the one called, the bearer, the fighter of your ideas, your ideals, your artistic intentions. Unquote. With some students, there were moments when the feeling of being expelled from the community came up. With Alban Berg, such a situation arose during the already difficult time of the Great War in the fall of 1915, as a hopeless gulf became apparent between the master's claims for help and his own interests. The extremely artistic moral, or artistically and morally extreme demands of Schoenberg's ideals drove a sensitive person like Alban Berg straight into despair. He writes, I quote, "During our conversation it came to light that you expected me to do things that one really only expects from an enemy. I consider this to be much more as the long-feared complete termination of your friendship, which catastrophe I had been inescapably heading for years." Unquote. Schoenberg did mercilessly use the cards of the decisionistically ruling artistic genius. Paradoxically, the result of such a psychological terror was less a phalanx of destroyed artists' hopes than a stately array of musicians who, on the pointed path of new ideals, rose to achievements of high value, which they would never have achieved without strict self-discipline. It is difficult to imagine the psychodramas that took place at that time between master and pupils, and probably also between pupils among themselves, especially since people usually tend to keep silent about catastrophic events in the hope of forgetting the ars oblivionalis. According to the sectarian school structure, each member of the group working on probation must have felt threatened with exile in case of failure or betrayal. Only in darkest hours one can imagine the tendency of the speech with which Anton Webern, instead of the husband and schoolhead Arnold Schoenberg himself, in 1908 persuaded the lovers Richard Gerstl and Mathilde Schoenberg to stop their flight under the sign of Cupid, breaking the gender autonomy of this woman towards a fascinating painter, and reducing Mathilde to the harbor of marriage, with Gerstl's suicide as a consequence. I come to the next point, 6, Little Piano Pieces, Opus 19. Access to difficulties of understanding. Thanks to topics, one can avoid the hierarchical constructions of a canon and effortlessly grant the right to exist to the light next to the heavy, the simple next to the complicated, the failed next to the successful, etc. The Kapellmeister activity in the Cabaret Überbrettel, for example, tended to fall into amnesia because it contradicted the Titanic image of the fighting hero of modernity. The artistic development of the young Schoenberg followed, as it seems, a steady curve of outbidding. It ended, however, like all such tendencies, in a dead end. Schoenberg became a prisoner of himself. All the more important is his own objection to such hypertrophic difficulties. The 6 little piano pieces correspond to Mozart's Sonata Facile or Beethoven's Sonatas Opus 49. Quickly written in the winter of 1911, as Schoenberg always used to compose, and after Gustav Mahler's death in the spring, supplemented by a last 6 piece, Opus 19 enables even moderately gifted pianists to access the sound world of atonal music. It can be performed by almost anyone of goodwill and seems ideal for leading into the spheres of expressionism, a shining symbol of artistic freedom. Arrangement of these piano pieces by musicians in sources of the Paul Sacher Foundation Basel show different ways and purposes of dealing with this much studied work. The histories of effect and reception, Gadamer and Jauss, so to speak, are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they appear as mutually dependent, corresponding models of understanding. And with this, I come to the last point, Opus 19, number 6, a stele for Gustav Mahler, interpreted by Heinz Holliger. The last piece from Opus 19 is closely related to visual art. Schoenberg, in friendship with Richard Gerstl, had begun to turn to painting, and in the years around 1910, he realized numerous works, also inspired by Wassily Kandinsky's and Frank Mark's Blaue Reiter, to whose almanac he, Berg, and Webern were to contribute songs and a text. When Gustav Mahler, who had returned to Vienna from New York, terminally ill, died on May 18, 1911, Schoenberg, who had painted Mahler the previous year, also recorded the funeral of his venerated colleague on May 22nd at Grinzing Cemetery in an oil painting. It belongs to the environment of the piano pieces. For the 6 of Opus 19, a static sound composition, a pianistic equivalent to the idea of a timbre melody, Klangfarbenmelodie, which was concretized in the orchestral piece Opus 16, number 3, and theoretically envisaged at the end of the Harmonielehre, was created, as I've said, as a tombeau for Mahler. Let's hear now Schoenberg's piano piece, Opus 19, number 6, played by Maurizio Pollini, and then Heinz Holliger's arrangement for chamber ensemble. The ensemble Proton is performing. In late autumn 2006, the Swiss musician rewrote this piece of Opus 19 on the occasion of an exhibition, Harmony and Dissonance, Gerstl, Schoenberg, Kandinsky, Painting and Music on the Rise, presented in the Art Museum Zug. He took this piece as an opportunity to explain affinities between the arts in connection with Gustav Mahler's death in the spring of 1911. Indirectly represented by Schoenberg's Mahler portrait vision from 1910, as well as by Opus 19, number 6, in a workshop discussion at the end of November 2006. The subsequent concert at the Theater Casino Zug focused on Gustav Mahler's symphony, Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth, in the reduction for chamber ensemble, initiated by Schoenberg and completed by Rainer Rien in the 1980s. The performance of this work, in whose cyclical sequence of movements the symbolism of life and death are intertwined, was supplemented by Holliger to form a triptych with two arrangements, which demonstrates the contrasting possibilities of reduction of an orchestral work to an ensemble work and expansion of a piano work to an ensemble work. On the one hand, Ferruccio Busoni's Berceuse Elegiaque, des Mannes Wiegenlied am Sarge seiner Mutter, Opus 42, in an arrangement for chamber ensemble. On the other hand, Arnold Schoenberg's piano piece, Opus 19, number 6, in the new, highly refined instrumentation for chamber ensemble, whose premiere Holliger himself conducted in the Zug concert. The last Schoenberg piece, which was post-composed as Tombeau for Mahler, thus became the first of Holliger's arrangement of Opus 19. Holliger transcribed the other 5 pieces only after the concert. The example testifies to a classicism of these anti-classical aphorisms for piano, Schoenberg's Opus 19, which helped many people to gain access to new music. Here we have reached the end of my keynote. Let us have again a short look at the different phases of this lecture. We have part 1 towards memorial typing in the 20th century, with general reflections on the remembrance of the dead. Then the 2 examples, ironic commemoration of the dead in Mahler's first symphony, and then the example of a dispute over in memoriam, over Strauss quotes Beethoven's Eroica in the early reception history of this work. And the second part, we have seen it, Schoenberg's Modernist genealogies with familial and artistic genealogy, Alban Berg as an example of descendant, so to say, and the last example, the 6 little piano piece, Opus 19, number 6, as a stele for Gustav Mahler, interpreted by Heinz Holliger. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.